Hello, this is the fifth instalment in this series of podcasts so far. I've been asked to, by somebody who'd seen one of the previous ones, who said I've mentioned issues to do with magic in one of those previous podcasts, I can't remember which one, and not gone into any detail, so would I go over some of that again in a separate one? So that's largely what we're going to look at today. If you can hear any weird background noises going on, I'm in the process of finishing off the quince cheese ready for Christmas. So that's boiling away, which might be making any weird noises you can perhaps hear. Hopefully not too intrusive. I'm also going to be making some apple scones today, so multitasking again. Let's turn that down. There we go. Now, magic, do bear with me in the chaos of faffing around. Magic is a bit of a difficult one to address, in that it's one of those words that means all sorts of different things to all sorts of different people, and tends to produce reactions when people hear you're pagan and you're talking about magic. A lot of people assume you're either completely barking mad, or that you mean something in the sort of Paul Daniels stage magician line, and you're going to be sawing ladies in half and producing elephants out of thin air or something in that line, which of course is not what it's about. However, answering what it is about is where it gets slightly challenging, because even amongst pagans you'll get different views and different ideas. One thing worth bearing in mind is that an awful lot of pagans in the ancient world, we're going back a couple of thousand years now, or even really more recently to that, if we're thinking tribes around Lithuania and Latvia and so forth, they were pagan to a much later date than were the pagans of the people of Greece and Rome and so forth, who converted much earlier. A lot of those people would not really have gone along with the idea of magic in that sense as part and parcel of their religion. It was something that a lot of people used, there we go, for day-to-day life. I'll explain a little bit more in terms of how I mean that as we go along. Super. That's about right. Okay. But the idea that pagan priests and priestesses would be engaging in ritual magic would have seemed quite strange to a lot of people in the ancient world, because to them they had a somewhat different idea of what constituted magic, who should use it, when they should use it, than a lot of people do these days, even within modern paganism. So, to give you examples, when we talk about this idea of magic, we don't mean the Paul Daniels stage magician stuff. Do we mean that kind of Harry Potter waving wands in the air and lightning bolts flashing about the room and people turning into frogs? As much as I have met people I would like to turn into frogs. No, that would be an insult to frogs, frankly. Nonetheless, no, that is not really what we mean. That's Hollywood cinematic children's literature type stuff. That the kind of wild and wacky fantasy versions where you just snap your fingers and astoundingly amazing things happen. That's not what the pagans of the ancient world were talking about, and it's not what pagans in the modern world, by and large, so for the really silly ones, talk about. It's rather the idea of achieving transformations in consciousness, inner work stuff, which is, if you're making a Hollywood film or writing a children's novel, is frankly desperately boring. That's why you never see that kind of thing in films, because who's going to be interested in that? So it's a different level, but it does include this challenging idea of what you actually class as magic. If we went back, well, I was going to say a few thousand years, but you only have to go back a few centuries, really. A lot of people would have consulted with the wise woman or the cunning man in their village when they had illnesses, and that wise woman or cunning man would have engaged in various practices. They might have whipped up various herbal concoctions to treat them with, poultices and ointments and potions and one thing and another. And part and parcel of administering those ointments and potions and such like was often prayer, chanting, drinking water from the local sacred well, all of that kind of thing. So it was a mixture. Now, from a modern point of view, in terms of modern day science, we know that whilst some of those herbal potions were not terribly useful in all fairness, a lot of them were. And there's all sorts of sensible scientific reasons that can be given as to why the chemical content of certain plants in combination treats this, that, or some other illness. And obviously most of modern medicine, in terms of the synthesized pills and ointments and what have you produced in laboratories, are derived ultimately from the herb lore of previous centuries. It's just been built on and refined and made more sophisticated, so that if you are mashing up a bit of parsley or something to go into an ointment, you can never guarantee the exact chemical composition of this clump of parsley versus that clump of parsley. It depends on the growing conditions and all sorts of other things. Whereas in a laboratory, you can synthesize the chemical components and regulate, so every single pill, every single jar of ointment or whatever it is, gets exactly the same chemical composition, which does not happen in herbal medicine, because you're using plants which have variable levels of the active ingredients within them. So it's the scientific approach, whilst it often has a lot of people worried about side effects of medication they're taking and so on, it standardises treatment in a way that ancient herbal treatments do not. These days, very few people in the West, at any rate, would class herbal medical treatments as magic. They'd give you all the scientific spiel about the active chemicals in the plants and so on. But in earlier centuries, it was classed as magic, and therein lies a bit of the issue, that what one generation classes as magic, another may class in some other context, whether in terms of science or some other way of understanding it. They wouldn't necessarily use the word magic again. Does that make it any the less magical? Well, if you're unwell and you take a treatment and then you're cured, you might feel it's quite magical in that rather more colloquial use of the word. You might feel it's miraculous in a sense, especially if you don't understand the ins and the outs of it. So it's an understanding of magic that changes over time, in the sense that a lot of technology we have these days, if you took it to a tri-pathway up the Amazon, or you went back in time and showed it to people 1,000 years earlier, would seem astoundingly magical. But do we class our mobile phones and all that kind of thing as magic when we're using them? We don't think of it. In a scene, you're sending ideas and information and images and words thousands of miles potentially in a split second. It is, in the sort of poetic sense of the word magical, it's amazing, it's wonderful, it's astounding. Do we use it to any great, massive, marvellously wonderful extent? Well, I should imagine if you surveyed the billion-odd messages sent every single day, probably 99% of it's going to be, I'm late home for supper, can you walk the dog? And that type of stuff. We're not using that technology to issue profound, deep statements about life, the universe, and everything, which is maybe why we see it as less magical. So it's not that the technology is any less astounding, it's just that we use it in a very prosaic, bland, boring way most of the time. Likewise, the internet, if you think about it, is unbelievably magical. It is one of the most incredible things. It changes the way people think, the way they interact, the speed at which it works, the distances which it covers are astounding. But if such histories are reported in newspapers or anything to go by, then most people use it to either look at porn or pictures of kittens. So it's not being used in an astounding, magical way, but it is in and of itself an astounding and magical thing. And so as we go further and further back into time, there are practices which are nowadays perhaps mainstream, which were once regarded as profound and magical and amazing. There are things that have been in the past used in a way that is arguably amazing and wonderful and magical, but which may not be used in a particularly amazing or magical way these days. Maybe it's become very prosaic in the styles of usage. There are things that in previous centuries people didn't understand, and therefore didn't understand how they worked. They knew they did work, they just didn't know the mechanics of it. And so they may have classed it as magical largely because they didn't understand the mechanics. These days we do understand the mechanics of some of these things, and so it becomes commonplace by explanation. in that sense, is magic, whether we're talking ancient magic or the kind of things people get up today, simply something which becomes magical, but has an aura of wonder about it, largely because we don't necessarily understand how it works. And if in 50 or 100 or 1,000 years' time we do understand how it works, will it then be considered boring and commonplace and humdrum? I suspect to some extent, yes. I realise I'm sort of rambling inanely on this one because it is such an awkward thing to try and explain. Magic, in that sense, it can include techniques to heal people of illnesses. It can include techniques to prophesy the future, to make all sorts of weird and wonderful things happen. Aleister Crowley, who was a ritualistic magician, he wasn't a pagan, ritualistic magician of the early part of the 20th century, famously said that magic was the art of bringing about change in accordance with your own will, your own wishes, in other words. And it's done in ways that, again, we're back to this issue, an awful lot of people don't understand. Why should prancing around a bunch of candles, chanting, and so forth have any effect whatsoever on someone's state of health? There's no obvious scientific reason why it should. Although there's research done around this idea that people who are being prayed for sometimes recuperate more rapidly in hospital. Is it a placebo effect? Is it this? Is it that? Is it something else? Whatever the mechanics of it are, there are a lot of people who feel a pattern of chain of cause and effect, that by their dancing around candles and chanting and doing very strange things, the thing they want to come about, whether that's the curing of an illness or whether it's finding a lost dog or a lost child, whether it's getting some direction in life in a person who is previously confused and bewildered, whatever the thing it is that they're after may be, they feel they achieve it. They may not be able to explain how they achieve it, necessarily, but they do feel that there is a direct connection between what they're doing and what then happens as a result. A lot of people of a more scientific bent would say they are totally misguided and very, very gullible to think that. But, in a sense, we have to reflect that if people attempted these things a dozen times and nothing whatsoever happened, the thing that they hoped for never ever came about, it would fairly rapidly reach the point where they just stop bother doing it. So they've got to feel that the results are sufficiently worth the amount of effort and palaver that they're going to. It's, shall we say, anecdotal evidence in that sense rather than scientific evidence. But it's one of these things that enough people feel is worth doing that they keep up with it. There are various distinctions made in some cultures between spiritual intervention, what you might loosely call religious magic, and more secular magic. So if someone, whether in the modern world or in the ancient world, prays to a deity, or to the fairies in the woods, or whoever it is that they want to pray to, please heal my child of their illness, or whatever it might be that's going on. Please ensure that we get a lot of good crops at the next harvest. Please ensure that the war my tribe is going to prove victorious and we vanquish our enemies. Whatever it is that they're praying for, and it then happens, that might in some cultures be classed as magic, but in other cultures would be classed as prayer, of seeking divine or otherwise external help in making something happen. In the cultures that class that kind of thing as prayer, they tend to feel that magic per se, whilst it is often exactly the same in the sense that you're doing one thing to produce something ritualistic, to produce an effect in a different area to which there is no obvious rational connection, would nonetheless feel that a magician, somebody working in active magic, is doing so by calling on some force other than a divine force. It may be that they're calling upon, or utilising, shall we say, the internal energies of their own body. You look at a lot of cultures, have Far Eastern cultures, for example, have ideas around ki or chi. Other cultures may speak about prana, this idea that all living beings emanate a sort of energy, a bit like in Star Wars, the idea of the Force, which is where George Lucas largely got the notion from. And that this force can be utilised and directed in various different ways. And there are people who claim to heal and claim to do all manner of weird and wonderful things by directing the force either in their own bodies or by utilising this energetic presence, whatever you want to call it, in the bodies of other people, like the patients they're treating if it's a healing, or that they utilise the spiritual force present within rocks and rivers and trees, that kind of, wherever it is they claim it comes from, that they have learned a technique, a method for directing it, channeling it, utilising it to their own goals, their own ends. So some cultures accept the idea of prayer as a form of magic, and others tend to not to class that as magic. So if we look at, for example, ancient Rome, they had laws against the strega, that's Italian, sorry, against the strix, the people who engaged in rather grim acts of magic, who would hire out to curse your enemies, to hex people you didn't want to death, so they're almost like a kind of magical hitman in a sense, and would, for the right sum of money, engage in all manner of other rather dodgy, unethical activities. So you could go to the temple and pray that the deity of the temple, Jupiter or Minerva, whoever it might be, would, let's say you've been robbed, that Minerva or Mercury or someone would punish the thief and cause them to return the stolen goods and visit plagues and boils and all manner of unsavoury punishments upon them as a condemnation for their cheek in robbing you in the first place. But that, to the Roman mind, was religion, it wasn't magic. If you went to the toothless old trout in the market square and paid her half a dozen sesterces and asked her to curse your enemies, that was magic, because she wasn't calling upon the power of the gods, she was calling upon some other force which was much more unmanageable, is perhaps the word. So the gods have will. If you ask the gods to do something and they don't want to do it, they will just refuse. So the curse tablets, the deficiones that the Romans loved, these were lead plates with a curse, please cause a terrible illness to fall down on the man who ran off with my wife, and that kind of thing. And these will be paid for and will be hammered out by people who specialised in making these deficiones. You just tell them what you want written on it and they'd bang it out for you. Then you take it down to the temple, pay some money to the temple, light your candles, say your prayers, and either affix it to the wall or place it in water or do whatever that particular temple required of you to do. And sit back and hope that if the gods approved of your request and they liked the food or the incense or whatever it was that you'd offer to them, then they would indeed bring about the punishment on the wrongdoer that you had asked for. But it was perfectly within their power, their rights as deities to refuse. And therein perhaps is the significant difference, that if you pay the money to the magician for hire on the marketplace, they can call upon forces which have fewer ethical qualms and would do things that the gods might not do. And therefore, that could leave all sorts of room for doubt. So if the gods have punished someone, well, the gods have punished them. If you have employed magical forces with no moral conscience to do something and they go and do it, then maybe the outcome is far grimmer, far darker, and socially unacceptable. And a number of cultures in the ancient world drew a difference between legitimate use of prayer, of chanting, of magic, of sort of spiritual activities, and illegal, illegitimate use of sorcerers, magicians, witches for hire, that kind of thing. Which, by modern standards, seems quite strange, and even for a lot of modern-day pagans, they've got the notion of witches and witchcraft as a sort of defiance of corrupt authority. We have lots of stories about, of varying degrees of historical veracity, I have to say, of people who either were witches or at least from the distance of history could be labelled as such. In other words, they're dead and can't argue back on that one. Who used magic to stand up against corrupt kings and princes and sultans and what have you. That kind of romance that the witch is a marginalised figure, deserving of sympathy as opposed to a dangerous sociopath causing mayhem, which was actually much more the opinion of the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, and a number of other temporal authorities in the ancient pagan world. It's not, some people see it as a sort of feminist issue, that these were women practicing magical arts who were disapproved of by the male priests of the temple, and in some cases there is certainly an element of that, and you could also say maybe this is as much to do with, well, unionisation in a sense, as it is to do with gender politics, in that if somebody went to one of these people in the marketplace, whether it was a toothless old woman or a toothless old man, and paid them money to place a curse or do whatever it was they were going to do, then that was money not going into the temple. So you could make the argument this is less about money and less about ethics and less about gender, and rather more about money. So some things, both ancient religion and modern religion, don't change much in that regard, in that cash often comes into it for all concerned. On the issue of ethics, so I'm rambling a bit here, I guess. On the issue of ethics, it's quite common for Hollywood filmmakers, horror novelists, people like that, to talk about black magic and white magic, and want to have nice clear-cut distinctions between the goodies and the baddies, and it all gets a bit Wizard of Oz with the wicked witches in the west and the good witches in the east and all that and the other. In the ancient pagan world and in the modern pagan world, you just don't get that. Not in reality. You get people who utilise their abilities, whatever they are, whether those abilities are being good at carpentry and wiring electrical devices up, or whether their abilities are in healing or in second-guessing the passage of fate, or whatever it might be. Some people who will use those abilities in a very pro-social way to help their friends, their families, help all the various people around them to try and make the world a nicer place and a better place and so forth. And equally, you get other people who are just very, very selfish and use their abilities to make their own life more comfortable and vent their spleen against anyone that they don't much like, and to make the world a darker, grimmer place, and don't much care what damage they cause to anybody else, so long as they get whatever it is that they want out of life. In that sense, an ethic of magic is no real different from an ethic of anything else, in that, let's say you are a talented writer, something nice and prosaic there. You could use your writing to produce inspiring, uplifting, funny, entertaining, engaging, educational books, or you could use it to write the vilest, nastiest of propaganda, vomiting up hatred and bigotry and divisiveness. The same talent could be put to a good end or a bad end. And within a magical context, for those people who believe that some people have this ability to channel the energies around them, or to make particularly strong and effective appeals to the worlds of gods and spirits to get things done and to intervene, however you perceive this magical process as taking place, It could be done in a very pro-social way, or it could be done in a very selfish way. It's the same procedures, the same forces in a sense. What makes it a moral or an immoral thing is the ends to which it's put. That said, within those cultures that see magic as engaging the help and assistance of other beings, be they gods, be they pixies at the bottom of the garden, be they forces of elemental nature or anything else whatsoever, those sorts of cultures usually have a very strong ethos that there is no such thing as a free lunch. That if you ask of another being to do something for you, it's going to expect something in exchange. It's scratching your back, you have to scratch its. So what is it that's going to be asked of you? In my experience, that very much depends on the character of the being you are communicating with. I've known deities and beings associated with the sea and the ocean, both things I've spoken to personally, and that friends and relatives and so friends have spoken to, who have asked for that individual to go and clean up the beach, to help sea life in some capacity. Deities associated with forests who want to see more trees planted instead of chopped down. It's often things within the remit and interests of the entity. Just as if you really, really like cake, and somebody comes and asks for your help and says, what would you like in exchange? Well, the most likely answer you're going to give is cake. You ask for things you like, for things you want. Naturally enough, beings tend to ask for things that they want. If you don't like the price that's asked of you, don't request that thing. Just say, I've changed my mind, no thank you very much, and put an end to it. Some people, shall we say the more ruthless, who are determined to get what they want no matter what the cost, regardless of how grim or awful or unpleasant or painful to themselves or to anybody else the price demanded, would say, I want this outcome so badly I will pay any price for it. And that definitely is where we're on a slippery ethical slope, in that if you want something but you're only prepared to pay a ethically comfortable price for it, or give an ethical thing in exchange for it, let's put it, the price is a bit, makes it all sound terribly capitalist and transactional, but you give something back that you're comfortable giving, so that if you're asked to give something you're uncomfortable with, you say no, then you're likely to stay within the bounds of your own ethic, your own moral comfort. Whereas if you are utterly ruthless and you don't care what you have to do, like people who want to be, let's say, famous actors or singers, there are some who will try and do it through their own talent by being hard-working and all the rest of it, and there are other people who will lie, cheat, backstab, clamber over ex-friends, will sleep their way to the top, will do anything whatsoever that it takes, no matter how dodgy, how unethical, how corrupt, so long as they get the success that they're looking for. Same in business, the same in all sorts of walks of life. There are people who are prepared to slit the throat of anyone who gets in their way to get ahead, and there are those who are not prepared to do that, who have a line in the sand and they say, I will do all the hard work, I'll do all this, all that, but I'm not prepared to do anything dodgy or corrupt in order to get where I want to go in life. That same ethos, that same approach is as true within the spiritual, magical realms of paganism as it is in business, in the path to stardom and fame and all of those kinds of things. So it's not a separate, peculiar, unique morality. It's the same morality, just applied in a slightly weird area of life. Some branches of paganism, Wicca for example, we mentioned that in the last podcast, I think, or the one before, have this idea that within magic you either, if you are corrupt, you have to pay back 3 times the damage you've caused, or if you're a particularly nice person, you get rewarded 3 times. And it's often in Wicca referred to as the threefold law. So that if you do something in a prosaic way, it's like for like, measure for measure. If you do something in a magical context, it's 3 times. 3 times the good or 3 times the bad. That as an approach is something developed within Wicca. a Wiccan author, Doreen Valiente, said it was a relatively late edition, and she could remember having the conversations where it was dreamed up as a way of trying to discourage people from being selfish and ruthless. So she effectively said it was not some ancient bit of wisdom handed down from the year dot, but something of much more recent origin. Whether you wholly go along with what she said, or you wish to perceive it as something ancient and going back to the beginning of the universe or something, entirely up to you. But not all pagans go along with that idea is the key issue that's worth saying. That it's just a concept found within one or two branches of paganism. Others take the approach that morality is morality, whether it's magical morality or business morality or any other kind of morality, and that there's not some separate ethical code applied within people using rituals, ceremony, chanting, praying, dancing rituals. You find those in a number of cultures, going off on shamanic vision quests, which is entering a trance-like state to experience other dimensions of reality and negotiate with the various beings, gods, animal spirits, what have you, that you might encounter in those realms. So there's all sorts of different takes and stances on the morality of how these things work. And some cultures favour certain techniques above other techniques. So it will depend on what kind of pagan somebody is as to what styles and approaches they will use. And some traditions, it's worth noting, particularly those who root back to the ancient world, aside from prayer and the seeking of intercession via deities and ancestors and so on, don't really do much of anything on the magical front. It's not all about wearing fancy robes and learning how to cast spells or any of that. That's seen as a separate area entirely distinct from their focus, which is on spiritual attainment, understanding, insight, growing in harmony with the realm of the gods, the ancestors, the other spirits. To give you an example, within Lithuanian paganism, which is called Romuva, I hope my pronunciation there is reasonable, there is a concept called Dorna, which is peacefulness, to be at peace, to be in harmony. And it begins by being in harmony with yourself. You've got to be not in love with yourself in some sort of deranged, egomaniacal, vain way, but you've got to like yourself, value yourself, accept yourself for who you are, in whatever context that may apply in your own particular life. If you can't bear yourself or you can't accept yourself, then within the teachings of Dorna, you're going to struggle to accept other people. Once you've accepted yourself, from that bedrock of personal stability, you then move on to be on good terms with your family, if you have one. I realise with some families that might be quite difficult if they're very stroppy, contentious people, but you seek to be on good terms with them as much as you can be, and from there you seek to be on good terms with your neighbours, and from the neighbours in your street you move out to the neighbours in your village, your town, whatever it is that you happen to live in, and from there the rest of your country, and from the country the rest of the planet, basically. So it's a kind of a rippling effect that starts small and builds big. And I should point out, it's not just being on good terms with humans, your fellow humans, it's being on good terms with, as much as you can be, at any rate, with other living beings, with animals, with trees, with plants, with your ancestral spirits, the dead, with the gods, with the realm of other beings that exist around us. So if we're thinking within the context of Remover, what is the purpose of being? It's not of being a member of that religion. It's not about learning magic or anything in that context. It's about establishing peace and harmony from your inside rippling outwards, like concentric rings on a tree, getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes. And once you've established, which obviously is the work of a lifetime, to establish that sort of harmony with the cosmos, you attain peace. That's the purpose. The methods by which you get there can be mystical, they can be prosaic, they can be a mixture of both, so long as you are peace oriented. That's the key factor. That's what's guiding that religion. And I'd say that is largely true of actually most forms of ancient paganism, that the heathens used to, well, still do, speak about frith, which is, again, peace. It's being on peaceful terms. Although you've got this popular film image that we mentioned in a previous podcast, you know, these Viking films and TV shows, where you've got all of these enormous burly men wielding axes, and it's all very testosterone-y, rah rah rah. The real goal is frith, to be at peace, to have peace in your homestead, your farm, or whatever it is that you live on, to be peaceful with your family and loving and nurturing and caring, to be peaceful with your wider tribe, your community, to be peaceful with your king, your leader, or queen or prime minister, whatever it happens to be. To seek that peace. Yes, we know in the ancient world there were big burly men wielding axes going around and belting others, but often that was a way of channeling testosterone, and you redirect your stroppier members to go to other parts of the world and vent their spleen over there rather than venting it in their own community, which isn't terribly PC in this day and age, but that's largely how things operated in ancient world. If you're at all interested in that concept, put Bruderbond into a search engine and look up the sociological understanding of that kind of male bonding as a way of channeling and regulating excesses of testosterone. But the key was, if you went off on a raiding party, you acquired what you could, often because there may be poverty at home, so you were looking for wealth in other communities. You'd go on a raiding party, snatch a load of gold and silver and sheep and anything else you could lay hands to, and then come back to your own community and invest that in a farm, invest that in your family. So it wasn't about spending your whole life being a warrior, running around with axes, chopping people up. It was a means to a greater end of establishing peace and harmony. And that's definitely worth bearing in mind, and it applies to thinking the Druids and the Celtic tribes. We've got the concept of she, which is a word that does also happen to refer to the fairy people, but that's a slightly separate issue again. But she fundamentally means peace, to be at peace, to seek peace, which is why a lot of modern Druids, not all of them, but a lot of them use a poem that was written by Iolo Morgannwg a few hundred years ago, who was a sort of Welsh patriot who wrote some books of slightly creative nature, shall we say. He composed a poem called The Druid's Prayer, which talks about peace in the east and peace in the west and peace in the north and so on. And it's very much this idea of establishing peace. It crops up again and again. We could sit and we could think of Greek equivalents, Roman equivalents, and even in nations like Rome, which were hugely imperialistic and military, the quest for pax, for peace. Admittedly, they went about it in a rather gruesome way a lot of the time, a way that really wouldn't go down terribly well in this day and age, when modern day empires try flexing their muscles, people get a little bit fed up with it. But the ultimate goal was establishing peace, establishing harmony. And that's a key concept that we can think about, using magic to heal people, and this idea that spiritual practice, whether it's herbalism, chanting, prayer, dancing around people, waving feathers in the air, whatever the thing may be, can be used for healing, it can be used for cursing, it can be used to get crop fertility, it can be used to ensure the fertility of your livestock if you have any, and all of those kinds of things. That's all part and parcel to trying to produce a greater sense of welfare, of peace, of making your tribe, your nation, your farm, your whatever it is that you have, a safe, secure, happy place to live on, where there's enough food for everyone and everyone's happy and harmonious. It's not just about selfishness and doing stuff for the sake of doing it. It's not that kind of mental approach to the idea of utilising forces, be they external spiritual forces, gods and ancestors, or using inner forces, if you believe in things like ki and chi and prana and so on, the spiritual emanations from within your own body or the natural world or wherever else. It's towards that ultimate long-term goal of making life better for your own people. And in the ancient world, they were very tribal. They thought in terms primarily of the good of their own people. They weren't terribly fussed about the good of other people in other nations. That was for them to sort out. These days, we obviously have a much more global perspective, and we think, or try to think, various degrees of success, about the good of all humanity and not just what's good for this country or that country. So that's changed, and that is largely as a result of Christianity as much as anything, of expanding from tribal consciousness to a much more universal consciousness, which is, I don't think that's any bad thing really, because we're now in a position with global news networks and the internet and so on to see the big picture and to realise how interconnected everything is, which people weren't necessarily able to do quite as well 2,000, 3,000 years ago. We can now see that if a country 500 miles in that direction is devastated by hurricanes and earthquakes, it may not have an immediate impact on my country today, but there will be a ripple effect. You get displaced people, it affects trade negotiations, it affects all sorts of things. We now see that domino effect, so we're much better placed at wanting the good of all rather than just focusing on the good of our immediate neighbourhood, which was much more the concern of ancient pagans. So modern pagans, you could say, have taken on, well, many of them, not all of them, have taken on board a lot of that global ethic of expanding their sphere of concern of who they want good for. I think that's more than enough. I've rambled on for over 40 minutes now. So we'll leave that one there. And maybe there'll be a sixth one, maybe not, I don't know. See how it goes. Hope you are, and I'm going to go back to finishing off my scones and this quince. Take care.